So we will get started. So welcome everyone to today's CBCS seminar. And the first thing I'm going to do is acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been custodians of country for tens of thousands of years and continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. And also make plenty of important contributions to this school, this faculty, to CBCS, and to wider Australian society. I also want to acknowledge any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in the room or online, and to encourage everyone to think about whose country you're listening from today if you're not with us in the room. The next thing I'd like to do is introduce our speaker, Claire. Now, Dr. Claire Mason is a postdoctoral researcher at CSIRO at the Socio-Ecological Systems team, and she's exploring climate adaptation practices in terrestrial biodiversity conservation. She's working on developing decision support tools for conservation managers undertaking climate adaptation in Australia and focuses on the management of threatened species and protected places. She has also got a PhD from the University of Tasmania, focusing on how climate variability and change influences the shy albatross. So Claire, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Lily, and thank you everyone for coming and for joining online after the Easter weekend. Yeah, I sit across the road, across Chancellor's Place in Queensland Biosciences Precinct, and I'd like to thank CBCS for the opportunity to present and also for including me in your seminars and morning teas over the last year or so. So I'm presenting on behalf of my project team today listed here, led by Alistair Hodday. And I'd also like to build on Lily's acknowledgement of country and recognise and acknowledge that our team works across many nations across Australia, and we acknowledge these nations as the traditional lands and as custodians of these lands. And I think today I'll be talking about climate adaptation, so I'd like to acknowledge that Indigenous Australians have been adapting to climate change for tens of thousands of years, and also acknowledge that when we're trying to understand Australia's climate and climate information, the real key value of traditional knowledge in that endeavour. So, yeah. Whoops. Thank you. So I thought I'd just start with a quick context set. I know that some of the people in the room might be working in the National Environmental Science Program, or NEST, and it's a very confusing space, but our project is in the Climate Systems Hub, and the Climate Systems Hub also hosts a cross-cutting initiative of climate adaptation across all 4 hubs, and we're Project 2.7. So this is what our future looks like, depending on mitigation efforts globally. We're looking at a range of different futures, up to 5 degrees down to 1.5 degrees. But really, for the next decade, we've got what is referred to as locked-in climate. So we kind of know what's coming for the next 10 years, and that's a pretty extreme increase in temperatures and extreme events and all kinds of things. So that's what we're looking at for the next 10 years. And so the 2 things that are needed here is mitigation, of course. So global reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and global agreements and commitments and all the things happening in that space. But I think from looking at the last figure, there's no real argument around the fact that we really need to address the local impacts of climate change stuff. And that's where adaptation comes in. So we're aiming to increase the flexibility in the management of vulnerable systems. And we know that natural systems will be one of the first to feel the brunt of climate change. So I'm sure many people have seen these burning embers plots. So looking at the white space as being kind of a safe operating zone, we know that we start to experience pretty severe impacts once we get around 1 or 2 degrees warming. And as we're all sadly aware, that's already here. So this is ocean temperature on the left and air temperature on the right since 1940, I think. So each grey line is 1940. We know last year, the yellow lines broke a lot of records, and black is how we're going so far this year. So it's already off to a pretty bad start for 2024. For natural systems, why do we think there's going to be limits to natural adaptation to these new environments and climate change? Well, we've already had extinction. So the example that comes to mind for me is the Granville Cay Melamies, which was the first mammal extinction to climate change of sea level rise on its island. And we've got some really strong evidence of changes in distribution, abundance, physiology, phenology, and the projections are for widespread loss for some species and ecosystems. But there is considerable uncertainty of how this will all play out. There's no clear patterns for winners and losers, so triage is very difficult. And so our role as scientists and managers is to monitor these changes, respond, and be really quick about the way we do this. And what are our options? And this is a framework used by the IPCC about how can we reduce vulnerability to climate change. And when we're starting to think about climate adaptation for natural systems, one way of looking at it is through these three pathways. So either reducing exposure, so taking, shading, translocation, taking species away. We've got sensitivity, so improving conditions, so things like supplementary feeding, habitat modification, disease treatment. Alistair, who leads this project, often when talking about this slide is reduce exposure, don't go on holidays to the hot place, reduce sensitivity, pack sunscreen. Or we can increase adaptive capacity. So this is often the space where conservation has acted. So reducing all the other stresses to increase the adaptive capacity of the species or system. So often when we're thinking about climate adaptation and planning for climate change, we're planning for 2050 or 2100, so this long-term future. For example, planting trees now that will be suitable in future climates, but it will be a bumpy ride to the future. So how do we start incorporating these extreme events on this path to a long-term future? So that's something else to incorporate into this decision making. This is also something to consider. So this was a very influential paper for the conception of this project, led by Aisha Tulloch, which I'm sure most of you know. So as well as systems and species being impacted by this short-term weather and extreme event, we know that conservation success of activities is also linked to near-term weather impacts. So this is threat management operations across Australia, and between 30 and 80% had a near-term weather impact on their outcomes before, during, after management. So this leaves us thinking about what is the role of natural systems managers under climate change. So in recent times, natural systems managers have been down that far left end of the spectrum, so more curators of the natural world, where the objectives are to preserve and protect. And the example there is the first national park in Australia in the late 1800s. Now we're very much in the ecologist analyst space, where objectives have become very important in conservation, and what do we want is the question. And with climate change and the extreme impacts that are being experienced and will occur, we're already in many cases operating down this far end of the spectrum in a more interventionist and engineering space, and this is happening, I think, a lot quicker than anyone has expected, and the pace of climate change may require this, which is very challenging for all of us, and yeah, lots of people. And I just wanted to add in this potentially a more where a better future perhaps. So, you know, Royal National Park in 1879, but of course before that, for tens of thousands of years, Indigenous Australians have been managing Australian caring for country across this spectrum. And how can we get back to this? And hopefully, before we get to this engineering interventionist space, we can move there above. So this leaves me to introduce our project. So we're aiming to co-develop practical products and decision support for conservation managers to operate down that end of the spectrum. So when hard decisions, as you can imagine, very difficult decisions to be made down that engineering and interventions end of the spectrum. And we're doing this through 3 aims. So this first aim, which is what I'll talk about most today, is we're collating options for active adaptation interventions to address climate change threats. So I'll talk today about the database that I've been building for a few years that showcases the range of options that are available in this space. We're also providing short-term seasonal climate forecasts to assist on-the-ground conservation planning. So that links back to increasing the success of climate change, taking into account seasonal weather. And we're also developing frameworks and decision trees to support adaptation planning in this space. So I'll quickly work you through how this all fits in. So as conservation managers and practitioners at the top of the screen, you have a need to make an adaptation plan and identify adaptation options. So moving down, our project will deliver a database of options and a decision tree to help you pick between options for interventions. And if you stop there and plan interventions for the long-term climate, you move across to your long-term outcome. However, we hope that if you take this second part that helps you decide where and when to undertake interventions and actions by taking into account short-term climate and weather, we can improve the long-term outcomes of conservation. So a climate adaptation intervention is an on-ground conservation activity that specifically addresses climate change vulnerability and incorporates climate information. So so this is a definition we have, is our working definition to help identify what we're talking about when we're talking about climate adaptation interventions. However, this schematic might help in your understanding of this. So across this spectrum is a whole range of conservation activities that contribute to climate adaptation. So on the far left, you've got recommendations, policy, monitoring, research, and all those things. And then within the triangle, you've got a spectrum of options that increase along that yellow arrow the specificity of the climate response. So you can kind of map it across those 3, the vulnerability framing bottom. So more traditional conservation activities such as broad overarching threat abatement. And then you're getting down into the on-ground physical manipulation of the system, things like supplementary feeding and disease treatment. And then right down this pointy end, which we're really trying to capture everything that's been happening in this space, are the really targeted climate adaptation interventions. So this often relates to reducing exposure. I'll talk today about the adaptation catalogue of collating all these interventions, and we have included things across this spectrum because they all contribute to climate adaptation. But what we're really aiming to is to get down this pointy end where there's novel, innovative approaches, because not much has been done in this space. Yeah, this is the new frontier, I guess, in conservation. So as a quick little example, Lily mentioned I worked on shy. I do have an albatross picture in my slide. So for shy albatross during my PhD, we worked to test some of these interventions. And so an action would be reducing fishing mortality or designating an MPA. A sensitivity intervention we tested was a disease treatment to reduce disease incident in chicks to improve survival. And our climate adaptation intervention that was very specifically targeted to climate was deploying artificial nests that improve breeding success. So big rainfall events that wash away the nests, the mud nests, we installed and trialled concrete nests to increase the probability of a chick, surviving, and fledging. And there's some other examples there. So during my PhD and now in this postdoc, I've been collating examples of these climate adaptation interventions that have been happening around the world. Originally with the species focus, but now through this project, we're also collecting interventions for ecological communities. So I'll talk a bit about this wheel later on, sprinklers to protect vegetation from fire, and restoration and things like that. And as you can see from these photos and imagine, there's many ways to intervene adaptation. So one long-term thing once, such as planting a tree or re-engineering a site, you can, like the example for shy albatross, deploy nets every breeding season, or you can change what you do year to year depending on the conditions or your objectives. And you can also intervene in an emergency or preemptively. So I'm going to talk through a bit about the adaptation catalogue for conservation now, or AdaptLog. We've got a working demo that we're testing this year, and these are the 3 entry points. So coming in with your question, you've either got a species or an ecological community that you want to see what's been done for that target. Different intervention categories, which I'll talk about again later. So what's been, what kind of translocations have been done, where people provided artificial habitat, and also threats. So again, that vulnerability framework, either a direct climate threat such as sea level rise, or maybe you've got a system where you want to reduce some of those extra stresses with a climate lens. So AdaptLog, we've got a current working demo that we're trialing with beta testers this year. We've currently got 492 interventions, and as I mentioned, a mix between the novel pointy end and also more traditional conservation applied with the climate lens. We've been including international examples, and we aren't up to an equal number of ecological communities left. So I really welcome discussions or information from anyone if you're aware of projects in this space. And we've also got translocation and habitat manipulation are currently the most common. And we've also got a bit of a range, even though 12% target ecological communities, there's still quite a few examples where the species has been the target, but the benefit has been more holistic. So, planting the food species is a more holistic rather than providing a little shade from the sun, for example. So I talked about intervention categories before and how we're categorizing all the different types of interventions that have been happening. And we're building on a paper that came out in 2018 by one of our colleagues at CSIRO, Suzanne Prover, who made a synthesis of options for renovating nature and climate change. So I just wanted to touch on this briefly to talk about the range of options that are out there and how the kinds of ways that they can be mapped across different spaces. So you've got on the far left, you've got the low breadth options. So things that build adaptive capacity that you do anyway and are going to help the system no matter what. And then you move into these more climate targeted options. So this includes things such as genetic interventions, promoting non-local species, and assisted dispersion to new habitats that become suitable under climate change. And then along the top to bottom is similarly the evade or ameliorate, so the more exposure sensitivity versus building adaptive capacity. And yeah, we've been doing some work mapping out typology and so anyway, we're working on this, and there's a lot of experts in this group, and I would welcome any discussions around this if you're interested. So building these tools, so the adaptation catalogue, conservation, the seasonal forecasts, climate reports, and our decision support. We've been working with conservation managers across Australia. So these are some of the groups that we've been working with. And a lot of these groups have been, they're all tackling some quite significant climate threats, and they're grappling with these questions and issues of how to manage systems that are changing. And I just wanted to talk you through one example to kind of demonstrate the kinds of challenges happening. So our first workshop was with an amazing group over about 80 kilometres south of Perth, a Peel Yargara Ramsar site. So it's a huge catchment, an assemblage of 17 water bodies, and it's Ramsar listed for 7 of the 9 criteria. So it's an absolutely spectacular site. And as I'm sure everyone is aware, the southwest of WA is experiencing some pretty extreme dry climate, so huge reductions in annual rainfall. And because this is a coastal system, they're also grappling with sea level inundation from sea level rise. It's also a very heavily degraded landscape with lots of agriculture. There's lots of artificial drainage, and the hydrology is very highly modified and it's been for decades. So this is the weir before. So I'm just going to, 2 of the 17 lakes, I'm just going to talk about briefly to contrast 2 different kind of conservation problems in the climate adaptation space. And this is Lake Neela, and they've had a really successful climate adaptation project here, where through a huge collaborative project and all the time scales lining up, like they're really thrilled to be able to got the approvals and everything through. They've installed a weir, which you can see here is diverting catchment flows into the lake, and they come out and manually turn this gate on and off to manage the water levels in Lake Neela. And they're trying to balance a ephemeral lake. So historically, this lake has been ephemeral, and that's supported all values that they're managing this Ramsar site for. So they want sediment exposed for the water birds to come and feed, but if they expose the sediments too much, they have to deal with acid sulfate soils. So they're currently, amazingly managing the site for its Ramsar values using this weir. And something else I'll say on the next slide actually. This is another lake in the Peel Yargara system called Lake Clifton. And this is a more challenging system, and they do not have any leaves to pull here. So these structures here are thrombolites. They're one of the oldest living organisms on the planet. These could be up to 2,000 years old. And they're benthic microbial communities that, as they photosynthesize, deposit these calcium carbonate pillars. And Lake Clifton is, this is one of the key Ramsar attributes in the site. And I think it's the only one in this, I can't remember the exact number, but there's very few examples of this around the world. But Lake Clifton is becoming hypersaline. So due to agricultural runoff and the changing hydrology of the site, these microbial communities, they've noticed a shift in the microbial communities, and they think that potentially this lake has shifted states into a hypersaline system, which completely threatens these thrombolites and the values associated with this lake. So that's just, they're not, they don't have any levers to pull that they can think of in this system, and are trying to work out what to do here. So from talking to these conservation managers around Australia, you can imagine that there is a lot of context-specific practicalities around deploying these interventions, and it's identified by these groups as the most important but difficult thing to capture for them to be able to use Adaptlog and decide what options they have up their sleeve and what they can do. So some of the things that we're trying to incorporate into the decision support and adapt log is information around these that can help inform people looking for something to do in these systems. So scalable proof of concept, barriers and enablers, the bureaucratic hurdles and lead time planning, like getting approval and support from your managers for things that are more novel and haven't been done before is a real barrier. And yeah, trade-off between impact and risk and yeah, social acceptability, things like that. One of the other things that we have been doing is, some of you may, I've got a couple here if anyone wants to look through them. We've been trying to bring together a bit of community of practice in this space and share success stories and support this kind of newish way of thinking about conservation. So we've released a couple of calendars that showcase 11 examples of success stories of climate adaptation around Australia, and they've been received really well. We got a 10% rose and thank you letter for one of them, which is a highlight. Yes. And so this project is on track to be delivered by December this year. This year we've refined our climate reports and we'll be mass distributing them to groups of stakeholders this year and trying to collect information on how they've been using seasonal climate information to make decisions. We're road testing the adaptation channel of conservation to refine the user interface, building new features and add interventions. So if I would be happy to talk about that with anyone who thinks that it's something that they might use in their work. And we're also continuing conversations with conservation practitioners and researchers to expand the decision support we provide in this space, and also love to talk to any about that. And that's it. So we're running a survey. If you work in conservation, we'd love you to fill it out. We're asking how you like to receive information about adaptation and the value of narrative in that. And yeah, this is my email, and I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. Does anyone in the room have a question to start? Yeah, Ricky.
Yeah, so thanks Claire for the amazing talk and the really powerful message about like conservation not being simply, nowadays conservation not being just about setting land aside from land clearing, for example, but thinking more broadly about the range of adaptation options to make sure that conservation outcomes are guaranteed or more robust than if we were just setting land aside and doing nothing about it. My question sort of relates to whether or not you have any experience or any plans to integrate Indigenous knowledge into informing your adaptation options. What is your experience in life, or whether or not it's useful, so Indigenous knowledge, how can they be used to effectively inform on the adaptation options that you present take in front of decision?
Thank you, Frankie. We, in our main kind of engagement with Indigenous communities and traditional knowledge has been through some other projects in the Climate Systems Hub that that's their focus of Indigenous-led climate adaptation. So that's been through the Shark Bay Mulgana group, and we've kind of piggybacked on another project for that. So and that's been more about presenting climate information. So they're at a very early stage in their adaptation planning journey and not ready yet to talk about even management in a sense. They're still kind of laying groundwork of climate impacts and the kinds of things that they value in on their country. But there is a lot of interesting discussions and work happening, especially around translocations and moving species from one area of traditional owners to another, and what we can do and help assist. I think in WA there's maybe been some like farewell ceremonies and welcome ceremonies to kind of pass on the custodianship to another traditional owner group. And yeah, there's a lot of interesting and important work happening in the space, and it's obviously so key. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Claire, that was awesome. What is the plan for the database? Is it going to be publicly available for anyone to use? So I have two questions. One, yeah, is it going to be publicly available, and can people here use it? And maybe answer that one first, and I'll come with my follow-up question.
Yes, in November, we're soft launching it, and in December it will be publicly available via a URL. If anyone's particularly interested in having an early look and help shaping the final product, we're running testing sessions this year with some beta testing. So please get in contact if you think this is something that you could use and would like to be involved in that process. Yeah.
Nice. And I was wondering if you have had academics or other research groups approach you interested in using this database so far, and what might they be planning on doing, or any potential projects.
Yeah, so our main, and because we're a NEST project, we're funded by DQ, the federal government department. So they're kind of our main end users that we've been focusing on, and they are very interested in the recovery documents and recovery strategies for identifying options to inject into conservation documents for listed species and ecological communities. We've also had some really good discussions with NGOs, for example, Bush Heritage and AWC and Arid Recovery, and they're kind of potentially a lot better positioned to be testing and gung-ho with some of these strategies. So that's been really exciting. And researchers, I guess government scientists, yeah, we haven't had a huge amount of engagement with pure academics yet, but we'd love to. Yeah.
Thanks, great presentation, very interesting, very curious to see, dig into the adapt log. I'm curious, it seemed to be a list of types of adaptation measures that people had taken. I was curious if there's any aspect of it that's kind of like the conservation evidence genre of work, where it's not just the list, but actually trying to assess what's working, isn't working. Is there any element of that in?
Yeah, that's been something that's we've been thinking about a lot, and has been a lot of feedback from stakeholders as well. It's something that's really important for them to know. They want to know what's worked, what hasn't worked, what's worth their while type thing. In my PhD, I published a review on adaptation interventions for wildlife, and found kind of one of the main findings was that there was so little publicly available evidence on monitoring and evaluation and whether it worked and things like that. So it is a real gap that people are trying things, and for a variety of very valid reasons haven't got strong experimental design or evidence as to how it worked. And it's also very context specific as well, I think, of even if it didn't work somewhere, maybe it could work somewhere else. So it's something that we are thinking about and working on. And yeah, we're throwing around ideas. We've got Aisha Tulloch, might be helping a master's student who's potentially online, might be helping us with a bit of that. But I guess the main aim is to get it all out there, and yeah, I think it's so important and very difficult.
Yeah, it's gotta be the first step, right? If you don't have a list, you don't know what sort of case studies you have to compare against each other.
Yeah.
So
But yeah, in the works. Yeah.
It was really nice for the answer. Actually, from asking about like, are you talking about like a very specific adaptation strategy or like overall climate change adaptation strategy? I guess like for the bushfire, that might be like different adaptation strategies, which will differ from like drought and like other type of extreme weather events. Like, do you have any like, are you talking in general like climate change adaptation strategy or event specific extreme weather adaptation strategy?
Yeah, for the events and climate, particular climate stresses, do you mean? So like adaptation strategies for drought or flooding versus just general climate change. Yeah. A lot of them, and historically in climate adaptation as well, there's a lot of strategies and recommendations are often for a very specific threat. And yeah, it's important to also consider and use strategies that holistically climate, cover off on everything of climate change. So I guess in Adaptlog, the threat category is how you would go in to search for particular events or variables that are increasing, or that would be that. But it contains both. Some are just general climate change, refugia, or yeah, there's both. That answers your question. Either the whole shebang of climate change or particular extreme events or variables. Yeah.
There are no more questions down the room. Kate, is there anything?
There was a very similar question online to Daniel's, so I won't repeat it. Compliments from you, great work. Anybody else online, you've got a question for Claire? And then you chat.
I've got another question while the chat people are thinking. So how holistic do you think your database is? So with your survey, do you think, do you feel like you had a lot of success getting people to fill out that survey and getting it to the right people? Or did you have any struggles trying to get people to volunteer information for the database?
Yeah. Yes, I has. So this survey is actually separate for collecting information on value of narrative. So that's kind of another research question. And currently the only way to add things to Adaptlog is by emailing me. But we're hoping that by the end of the year, there's a feature where people can submit what they're doing. And it has been quite difficult to, because it's mostly been me collecting all these things, and I've had a variety of methods and been having conversations. I've kind of been meeting with people and saying, what's your organisation doing? I can add in. Yeah, it's hard because a lot of it is grey literature and not publicly accessible. So I guess that's also the hope through this, that we can make some kind of way for everyone to easily share and put things on. So it's hard to know how comprehensive it is, but hopefully through this year of sending it out and getting everyone to look at it, people feel compelled to add information. So yeah, at the moment, yeah, it will never be comprehensive, but there is, I feel, a very broad range of options. But I'm sure there's even more happening.
All right, it's sorry if I've missed it because I'm still a bit trying to wake up this morning, but no, very interesting, and thank you for a well presented seminar. I'm just interested to know to what extent you might be interacting with NGOs like the Australian Wildlife Conservancy or Bush Heritage, because as far as I know, particularly AWC does collect quite a lot of information on their interventions. Now, they might not all be climate related, but some of them could be relevant.
Yes, we've got AWC testing, one of our beta testers for Adaptlog this year, and a few other NGOs, Rebecca Beck-Spindler and a few other people. That, yeah, I think it'll be a really valuable endeavour this year to have them look at what we've recorded about what they're learning to see if they can fill in any gaps. And I know that, yeah, they are a huge source of information, of, yeah, the evidence and, yeah, right, yeah.
Thank you.
Really.
So in terms of developing strategies to reduce sensitivity to relocate different species, have we has the work factored in on genetic diversity? Because that can be a part with the certain species considered in some mutations and some mutations they can't. So,
Yeah, I think, yeah, genetics is very key, isn't it? And, one of the categories in adaptation is genetic rescue and intervention and management. And there's been some really cool examples. For example, the pygmy possum, they just, translocated 5, I think, males from one mountain to another mountain. And it just was hugely successful. Population genetic diversity went through the roof and the population was recovered. That was 20 grand or something compared to creating a captive breeding population. And yeah, so I think there's a lot of exciting things that genetics can really help. Yeah. Thank you.
Claire, how are you going, Claire? We've got to have a word that is just hammering any questions.
Thanks very much for the really excellent talk and really interesting long development. I'm just curious for the long recommendations for the various across species community or ecosystem. Does it recommend when the user trying to access it, does it recommend a whole recipe of different adaptive intervention, because some can be, you need more than one action just to be successful, or is it very case specific one action for each different type of, and in general, does it account for the interactions between different interventions?
So at the moment, the layout will be, you'll go in through one of those 3 entry points, either searching for a species or an ecological community, and I will turn a whole list of everything that's been done in there. Then we'll build in some filtering as well. So we've got information in there like location, organizations involved, time span, things like that. And then you'll receive a whole list of options. So yeah, it will be completely up to the manager to explore and find out more information. Yeah, definitely won't be recommending anything, but the decision support will be providing extra considerations, guidance through considering extra things like cost, time to impact, effort, social acceptability, things like that, which will hopefully help people kind of weigh up between, will I put out nest boxes or will I restore a forest, or, you know, kind of weighing up between those different decisions. Ingrid Van Putten, who's on our project team, is an economist, and so yeah, that's what we're kind of working through this year, of how to provide that in a helpful way, so that people can choose between a huge list of options that hopefully will come out. Yeah.
We might wrap up there. There's nothing else burning online. So if you could join me in thanking Claire.